All right. Today, in chapter 31, we're going to start a troubled nation. So, in 31:1, we continued to talk about the Nixon administration, and we see a thaw in the Cold War trying to happen here. That's called a détente. Okay, and that a détente is when you're attempting to ease those international tensions. So we'll see a few different examples of this. One thing that happened was that Nixon visited Romania during this time, 1969, and he was the first president to go behind the Iron Curtain, so that's a really big deal. And then he starts working on relations with China. As you know, right, we've had really strained relations with China since it became communist in 1949. And remember, we've been long against communism spreading. So when they took over in China and their leader moved, I guess, to Taiwan, we supported him. Kai-shek is his name. Instead of we didn't recognize the leaders that were still in China, the communist leaders. And they, of course, renamed China the Communist People's Republic of China. So for a long time, we refused to acknowledge that and have relations with China, and instead we thought that, the true ruler is over in Taiwan. So that's a problem for a long time, but it's during Nixon's administration that starts to change. And one of the ways that happened was kind of through back channels. There was this, it's called ping pong diplomacy, because some ping pong players, the U.S. player befriended the Chinese, and then we were invited, the ping pong team was invited, and then that started, some talks. And Kissinger goes and on a secret trip, and they start actually, working on the relationship, trying to improve the relations. So that's why it's called ping pong diplomacy. And also, it's at that time, remember that we're still in Vietnam, and Nixon was hoping, if relations were, remember we talked about they were working on relations with other communist countries to try to help there, right? So, and also, neither China or the United States really trust the Soviet Union. So if we get on China's good side, maybe, right, that will work against, we want the Soviets and the Chinese to be separated. We don't want them to be friendly. Okay. So anyway, we start opening trade relations with China, things like this. Okay. And then eventually Nixon does go in 1971 on a visit to Beijing, the Chinese capital. So that was huge news. All right. Let's see. Oh, and so we start agreeing that we're going to work on not only increased trade, but other, cultural exchanges, things like this. Okay. So like the ping pong diplomacy is an example. All right. The Soviet Union. Remember, Kissinger was also trying to work on things with the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union doesn't like to see the U.S. and the Chinese getting along, right? They're afraid of an alliance between us. Also, they would like to collaborate on like our technology. So the détente is also with the Soviets, us trying to work on relations with them. Nixon went to Moscow and actually met with Brezhnev, their leader. They signed a strategic arms limitation treaty that's nicknamed SALT. There's first one, there's more than one. And remember, that's been a long an issue about all the nuclear weapons and trying to limit them and not having this big buildup between our countries. Also, we said we are going to work together on some different trade initiatives and science initiatives. So I put a picture there of one of the big, examples of us working together was the U.S. Apollo 18 spacecraft and the Soviet spacecraft. They linked up in Earth's orbit in 75. So that's an example of us working together. Okay. All right. And another situation I want to talk about was in Chile. So in Latin America in general, right, we've been also very conscious. Remember, we talk about Cuba a lot, right, of what's going on in near us. And there was something happening in Chile with, we have been remember Kennedy's idea was shoring up, trying to economically help Latin American countries, right, so they're not prone to communism, remember? So in Chile, a new president, Allende, he is elected, and he is socialist, Marxist. He was a follower of Marx, and he, which, means he's also communist, right? Has communist leanings. So we're watching this very carefully, and he starts doing some things like that would affect the U.S. businesses there. For instance, your book doesn't really go into detail, but one of the things he does is like kind of take back control of, I believe it was copper mines, and that's going to hurt U.S. businesses, right? We're going to lose out on things that we have spent money on developing, and so, that's normal in a communist country, right, for the government to take over and control the businesses and kind of dole out the money to the people, right? And that, of course, goes against what U.S. interests would be. So anyway, no, we are very aware of what's going on, and it's proven that the CIA knew what was happening, in that some Chilean military leaders overthrow the government, and they have a coup to get rid of him. And Allende's killed. We actually think that he committed suicide rather than be embarrassed and forced out in this coup. There was some rumors that it was assassination. I know later there was a big investigation, and it was shown that it was really suicide, and that even his family admitted that he had said things like that he would never be, just give up or be taken alive or whatever. So we don't really know exactly what happened, but interesting, the, coup happens, and the U.S. immediately says, great, the new dictatorship that took over by force, yep, we're in favor of it and we'll help support it, right? And we're doing that because our economic interests are more aligned that way. So that's an interesting change of events, considering he was elected, democratically. We just didn't like how it turned out. Okay. Let's switch over to the Middle East. So also during Nixon's administration, there has been a long-standing problem, right? But it kind of comes to a head during this time again. So really to backtrack for a second to make sure you understand what's happening in the Middle East. So I don't know if you remember, way back in the 40s, 1948, Israel is first given their land for themselves, 1948. It's a really long story. I'll show you a video. It's a long-standing problem. In 8th grade, we go into it in quite more detail, so you'll understand it a little bit better. But both the Palestinians and the Jews both claim this area as like their homeland, And in 48, it was agreed that, that Israel could have its own land, and the Arabs surrounding it did not agree with that, right? Even though we have the whole world watching and trying to negotiate these problems. So anyway, they've been attacked numerous times they're surrounded by all their Arab neighbors who don't agree with this, okay? And so they've been attacked several times. And then there's something called the 6-Day War, where again, the Arabs attack Israel. Egypt, it closes off the waterway. They don't mention it in your book, but it's one on the very southern tip there. The Strait of Tiran is right there. That is the one that they're closed off. And they're sending troops over and invading, going over the line. So it's, of course, taken as an invasion. Israel, well, they're right at the line, I should say at this point. Israel go ahead and says, okay, you're obviously acting aggressively towards us. We're going to bomb your airfields before you can get your ships up in, I'm sure not ships, the airplanes up in the air to bomb us. And so Israel fights back really quickly, and they are actually able to take back land that from their Arab neighbors. So they take the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and Golan Heights, which is part of Syria. So you can see that in the second map there, all the places that by fighting back they've taken over. So even though it was the Arabs who started this, and they have numerous countries, right? They have Egypt, Jordan, and Syria all working together. Israel is able to fight back and actually do better. So it's pretty embarrassing for the Arabs, right? That they actually get a lot more land. And the UN is trying to, negotiate this. So it's only 6 days they're able to take all that. UN asks Israel to leave those lands. And they say, Arabs, if they leave your lands, then you have to finally accept that they have the right and stop invading them, or whatever. And the Arabs refuse. They are not going to negotiate with them. So Israel says, okay, fine, we're staying here. And they're going to have those. And so now there's a lot of Palestinians who are actually in Israel territory. So that's going to be an issue, long-standing issue, where we have now, Israel controlling areas where Palestinians are living. Okay, so that's going to continue being an issue for quite a while. All right. Then there was the Yom Kippur War, is what they're called. Yom Kippur, if you don't know, is the most important Jewish holiday. And again, in 1973, Egypt and Syria attack Israel and trying to get back that land that they had lost previously in the 6-Day War. To make a long story short, at first the Arabs looked like they were doing it, and they took the Israelis by surprise on their holiday, right? And then Israel fights back. The U.S. actually helps them out. They're our allies. The Arabs, by the way, are also, especially Egypt, is backed up by the Soviet Union. So things got really tense, right? That this Middle Eastern war could draw in, right, the big superpowers of the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And so things were really tense again. So the UN negotiates a ceasefire. And so we do stop, the fighting does stop, but the Arabs are really angry that the U.S. came in and helped the Israelites. So they are going to punish us by having an embargo on oil. Okay, so they stop sending oil to the United States. And at this point in the history, we are very dependent on oil from the Middle East. And that embargo really hurt us. It made the gas prices go way up, right? There's a big shortage. You can see in the picture on the right, there's the lines. Cars are lining up just to get into the gas stations. If you Google it, there's other pictures showing you gas stations saying, sorry, no gas, they're out. And so this is a big problem for our economy, right? And of course, U.S. and Egypt are going to have, bad relations, right? And other Arab countries. So Kissinger, remember the Secretary of State, does something called shuttle diplomacy, where he is traveling around the Middle East to all the different countries, to their capitals, and trying to, fix this problem, try to get them to negotiate to stop the embargo and to, have peace. One of the people that he talks to is Golda Meir, who's the Prime Minister of Israel at this time. There's a picture of her. And Anwar Sadat is on the right there, the president of Egypt. He does get them to agree to some peace in that area. So that's pretty big. He also gets the Arabs to stop the oil embargo. So Kissinger was a good negotiator. And he starts fixing our relations with Egypt, mostly by promising we'll give them foreign aid, right? Money. So Kissinger is trying to, soothe things over in that area. Okay, and then let's talk about domestic goals. Domestic means at home, right? So Nixon is the president, and he has promised things in his presidential bid, right, in his campaign. One of the things he promised was to bring back law and order and crack down on crime. Remember, we talked about that back when we talked about the last election. And so he does follow through with that. He's tries to get the Justice Department to have stiffer penalties for lawbreakers. He gives federal money to the states and their police forces and in the city and the states. He also has quite a few for Supreme Court justices. Remember, we've talked about that in current events and things, how influential that can be. So it's during his time that Warren Burger becomes the Chief Justice, and Nixon gets to pick Henry Blackburn, Lewis Powell, and William Rehnquist, and they're all on the more conservative side. Now, they don't always, agree with what Nixon would want, and they're not quite as consistently conservative as he was hoping, but he does pick them that he thinks are going to be more his way, right? So that's going to affect the court and their rulings quite a bit. He also wants to reduce government involvement in the people's lives. That's a pretty traditional Republican thing to do, as well as cutting federal spending. So he introduces something called new federalism, where basically it's they call it revenue sharing, that giving some of the federal money from taxes and give it back to the states. And the states can use the money themselves for state initiatives, or they can give it to the smaller cities and towns. And so that's called revenue sharing, and that's a new idea of reducing the government and letting the people more directly do, right? And not having a big oversight of a big government, okay? To reduce the federal spending, he also is going to cut back a lot of agencies that he thinks are ineffective. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't make any new ones. He does make new ones to address issues that are important during this time period. One of them is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or people call it OSHA for short, based on the acronym. It's helping worker safety, and that's still today, that if you, there's a lot of laws that businesses have to follow about safety issues, even like Pinewood. So there are different things to help protect workers' safety, especially more like in factories and things like that, wearing helmets, right? All these kind of safety rules that have to be followed. All right, and then the Environmental Protection Agency, I'm sure you've heard of the EPA, and that is still around today. And it was starting during this time to help protect the environment, and is still working on that today. Some other issues that are important during this time period: affirmative action was already started by Reagan and by Nixon's time. but he is also in favor of promoting it. And if you don't know, affirmative action is when you're trying to help people from disadvantaged groups. Usually people think of, African Americans or people of color, right? Groups that have been kept down in the past throughout history, and you're trying to make sure they have opportunities. Usually that's talking about in education or in jobs. And so it's kind of a controversial topic. There's been some lawsuits, right? Like colleges, they would have certain percentage of people, let into the college, have to be of like African American, let's say. Well, and then some people, like white people, right, are like, that doesn't seem fair. Why should they get a certain number? Well, that means someone could be less qualified than me, even though, but they get the position, or in education, like the acceptance, because just of what color. And it's really controversial, and I can see both sides, right? Like I'm sure you can too. If you can see how that white person would think that, but then also if you don't do things, they've always had the opportunities going up, right? So if they've never had the best education and opportunities, are they going to eventually get to ever have, be able to compete equally? So it's a controversial idea, but it's still something that's talked about a lot today. And then this last one, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, again, trying to have legislation or laws that are helping people with disabilities. And we had talked about that previously, that was starting to happen. And here we have this major law that's also going to try to help them. Okay. And then the other thing I want to talk about is the economy. Poor Nixon, he has a really bad economic issues going on. He's had a lot of issues during his presidency. Why is the economy not doing well? First of all, it's hard. The manufacturers are struggling against competition from other countries. There's a lot of inflation during this time. We've talked about inflation, right? Increases in the prices of goods and services. And why is inflation increasing? Well, international competition for raw materials. We've talked about that a lot. Increasing the cost of oil. Remember, we just said that if oil and gas prices are up because of all the problems in the Middle East, then of course all of the businesses are affected, right? Because it costs you more to ship your materials or any kind of travel or things like that. And there's just slow economic growth and high unemployment during this time. So the economy isn't great. Nixon tries a few different things, 3 different things to fight the inflation. First, he tries cutting the federal spending and raising interest rates, and he wants people to borrow less money. Unfortunately, that makes people, businesses kind of cut back. People don't spend the money, and prices end up rising even more. And so that's people call it stagflation. Then he tries ordering a temporary freeze on wages and prices. And he also set guidelines for any further increases. And it did slow inflation, but, the economy still remains low. And so he tries a third thing, which is to stimulate the economy. He increases federal spending, which originally he was against, right? And it does kind of help the economy for a little bit, but then we end up with a budget deficit. You've probably heard of a budget deficit before, when the government spending is greater than the government's income. So none of these attempts really worked, and the economy is still continuing to have trouble during his whole presidency. Okay, so now it's time for the re-election of him in 1972, and he is pretty worried, right? And so because he's worried about this election, he does some things which are basically illegal. And we're going to talk more about that later. I'm sure some of the things he did. One ordering the FBI and the IRS to investigate people that he considered to be enemies of his presidency. So that's an overreach of your power as president to go, investigate people for your own benefit. Also, he used campaign money for secret actions against the Democratic Party. We're going to talk about that next time. I'm sure you've heard of Watergate. We'll talk about that more next time. But so anyway, he gets himself into quite a bit of trouble for doing these questionable activities. It turns out he didn't really need to worry anyway, because the Democrats are basically a mess. They have 4 different people all vying for the nomination. There was the former Vice President Hubert Humphrey, which we talked about him before. There were 2 senators, Edmund Muskie of Maine and George McGovern of South Dakota. And then the former governor, George Wallace, we've talked about before, from Alabama. He ends up getting an assassination attempt. He isn't killed, but he's wounded and he drops out. So then it's just the others. So basically, long story short, McGovern ends up winning the nomination. But the problem with McGovern is he is seen as really liberal, and a lot of Democrats did not feel like he was a good, pick. And so especially people like labor union leaders who were very influential and felt like he is, going to hurt what they want. So even though he wins the election, the party isn't really totally behind him. Also, he has some controversies during his election, during his campaign. Your book didn't go into it, but basically the running mate, Thomas Eagleton, it turns out that he had gone through electroconvulsive therapy. Have you ever heard of shock therapy for depression? And then that made him look like, he wouldn't be a good leader. So they actually replaced him with someone else on the ballot. So that's kind of a controversy. So between those different things, it's kind of a mess in the Democratic Party. So Nixon, in comparison, right? Yes, things aren't great, but the economy, he's doing things. It's, slowly maybe getting a little better. And, they're working on peace in Vietnam by 1972. They're getting close, right? It looks like it finally might end. So people, vote for Nixon in a landslide, and he wins. 61% of the popular vote. And of course, if you look at the chart, the electoral vote is even more lopsided. He gets is 520 to 18. So quite a big margin. Okay. And so we will talk next time about that. All looks good, but then of course things go really bad for Nixon soon.